So I think we'll get underway. We don't want to keep people away from the whiskies for too long. We've got 6 fantastic whiskies. Welcome, Patrick van Zuidam. He's the managing director and distiller from the Zuidam distillery, all the way from the Netherlands. And the advantage of COVID is that we now have access to all these guys around the world. It's terrible for them. They're still in lockdown. They can't go anywhere. So the most fun they have is talking to the likes of us. So hopefully we can make that as pleasurable and fun as possible for Patrick. So welcome, Patrick.
Hey, hi David. Hi everybody. Yeah, let's ask lots of questions so we can get a nice informal, get together with some whiskeys and some, informal conversation about whiskey. So where do you want to start, David?
Well, I think it's important. These guys have been staring at their little pack of whiskies for a week or more now since it arrived in the mail. So we'll talk a lot about your whiskies, your distillery, and what's coming up next. But first, I think let's start with one of the whiskies. And a good place to start would be the 10-year-old American Oak. If you guys at home can grab your samples.
You really think that they haven't tried it yet? Would you not try it? On the down and low, just to...
I have to say, there's very few times where I've had a sneak peek or a sneak taste. I kind of torture myself.
In Holland, in Holland, nobody would wait. Yeah, we are not that law abiding in Holland.
Okay, so let's look. We don't judge around here. So come on, guys, pop up in the chat. Tell us who has tried these samples, not the whiskies, but the samples before tonight. Who's opened theirs and just did a bit of a quality control check? Okay, so Andrew's waited, but so let's get into the 10-year-old American Oak, and it's one that I certainly haven't been familiar with for a while. And Patrick, I'll leave it up to you to talk through it.
Yeah, the 10-year-old American Oak is one of our core range whiskies. Of course, it's a whiskey that's been matured in both refill American Oak cask and virgin American Oak cask. So basically, these casks are bourbon type casks, but we don't buy the bourbon cask. We buy them virgin oak, and then we reuse them for our whiskeys. So we buy new casks and reuse them. And this whiskey is a blend of both whiskey that has been matured in first fill virgin oak casks and whiskeys that have been matured in refill casks. So the idea behind the whiskey is that you get a balance between the wood influence and still the distillery character, of course, which is important, I think, in our business, that you create this balance between different flavor profiles of the different casks. So I think that is my job as master distiller to create that kind of balance. And then I think in this whiskey you will find all kinds of notes. So, I'm not going to tell you what kind of notes you will find in this whiskey, because you're more than capable of sticking your own nose in the glass. But I think one thing that we might want to point out is that I always get this like orange kind of peach nose, like stone fruit orange, stone fruit like peaches or oranges kind of nose in this American Oak, which is something about the way our new make interacts with the American Oak casks, and that creates that orange note. You will maybe also find it in the Millstone rye whiskey, the 100 rye whiskey that we taste later. But it's something that is very typical for our distillery when we age our products in American Oak. Anybody agree with me, or everybody disagree? You're welcome to disagree, because this is the beauty of our business, that you do not have to agree with me whatsoever.
Yeah, so Jason just popped up. He says, sorry, it's a bit late. So we're on the American Oak 10-year-old. That's the first one we're tasting. And it looks like everybody waited. Nobody opened theirs. Well, they're not. If they did, they're not admitting to it. But no, everybody has commented.
I sometimes get this when I'm abroad. if you do a live tasting as well, you actually have to tell people that they can try the whiskies that they have in the glass. If I do a tasting here in the Netherlands, sometimes the glasses are empty before I ever open my mouth. Yeah, this is people. We do not have that kind of self-control that you guys exhibit here. Shall I tell you a little bit about the background of the distillery, or what do you want to go into?
While we're
David?
enjoying the 10-year-old American oak, the name Millstone, it's the Zuidam distillery, and that's been going. Your father started that 1975. But where does the Millstone name come from?
Oh, that's a bit of a silly story. When we created whiskey in the 90s, in the early 90s, when we decided with the family that we would start distilling whiskey, we all agreed that our family name was too hard to pronounce anywhere else in the world. So we decided that we would want a name for the whiskey that was a little bit more pronounceable. And originally, I came up with the name Lowlands because the Netherlands is also called the Lowlands. Therefore, I thought that was a fitting name for the whiskey. Of course, with a little wink to my Scottish friends that have a region in Scotland that's called the Lowlands. But I got, the day before the introduction was supposed to be, labels were ready, everything was ready. Day before the introduction was supposed to be of the brand, I got a letter from a couple of lawyers from Mojo Concerts, who have a Lowlands concert here in the Netherlands, like a festival. And they claimed that we were in breach of their trademark. So then I had to decide on a Friday evening whether to fight them or create a new name for the brand. And after some heavy thinking and a couple of whiskeys, I decided it wasn't worth going to court over it. And then we created this name that we wanted to have a connection with the way we produced it, with the Netherlands and the way we produced it. And with that people could pronounce everywhere in the world. So this is where we came up with Millstone, because back then 100% of the grain was still milled in traditional windmills. And those windmills, I don't know if you know that, they have a big stone where the grain is crushed in between the two stones, and they called millstones. Therefore, the name Millstone came into being. And actually, with hindsight, it's a lucky thing, because I think the name is better than the original name that I came up with. But yeah, there you know these things in advance. But yeah.
I was going to ask you about the windmills, because there's this legend that there's pictures on your bottles of these fantastic old Dutch windmills, and that you use those to grind the grain, and it's very romantic and it's evocative of, you can picture these things with
it's
the
a
wind
good
slowly
marketing story,
turning
isn't
them.
it?
Yeah, it's fantastic, and so is it true?
It is 100% true. Though these days we use about 5 different windmills in the Netherlands to mill our grain. And the remainder of the grain is these days, for the past 5 years, we also have an in-house mill where we mill part of the grain in-house. But previously, 100% was milled in these windmills. And the thing was, it never started as a marketing story, because in 1992, when I told my father I wanted to do whiskey, we did about 150,000 euros worth of sales in our distillery, in our little family distillery. So basically, there was no money. So my father said, Patrick, I applaud it if you want to do whiskey. Go ahead. Just keep in mind that we haven't got any money, so you have to be careful how we go about this. So a grain mill is expensive. I looked into it, and it was about 20,000 euros to buy a proper grain mill. So I went to the local miller. He had a windmill in town. And I said, Mr. Miller, you have a mill and I have grain. Could you please mill this grain for me? And he said, well, you have a distillery and I like Geneva. So if you give me a bottle of Geneva, I will mill your grain for you. So this is how this started. Yeah, just straight out of poverty more than anything else.
Right, and obviously with an electric mill, you can have your blade. You can work out exactly how fine or coarse you grind it. Do you have the same level of control with the windmills, with the millstones, or is it just
Yes.
as it comes?
Well, no, they can regulate the grind, the coarseness of the meal that they mill. Um, so it's a wonderful, and of course the millers, the traditional millers, they claim that any grain milled on the stone, on the windmills, is of course better quality than anything milled in our roller mills here in house, because of the stones keep the temperature of the grain much cooler than it is, because when you mill something, you can imagine that you also by the friction heat it up a bit. And of course, the windmills grind more slowly and have more mass in their stones, so they prevent the grain from heating up too much. So yeah, according to the windmillers, the guys that run the windmills, the quality, of course, is way better of the grain milled in the windmills.
Of course they do. Well, let this go on
They
to
are
the
these
next.
people are fanatical about their trade. Yeah? So, we make whiskey and we are fanatical about that. But these people, they spend their entire weekend, milling grain. They do. Some of these people do like 2 tons a day. But that means 80 bags of grain hoisted up the windmill and manually shoved into into the bags where the boxes where they store the grain while it's being shaken into the stones. It's hard work. These people do this for nothing. Yeah, they do this for hobby. Well, they save on gym cost. Yeah, they never have to go to the gym.
Absolutely. Yes. Um, there's a question from Nigel, which actually is preempts an upcoming part of our chat, which is he thinks American oak is delicious, as most of us do.
Thank you for that.
But he asked about the new make. What do you do differently? Now, are those orange notes, that fruitiness, is that inherent in the DNA of your new make spirit? And what do you do differently to give it that character?
Yeah, that's of course a very complex question, because to be honest, I'm not completely sure where the orange note comes from. But the thing is that we find it if we combine any of our new makes, so whether it's the rye whiskey or the malt whiskey, and we combine it with American oak cask. So it's something about the combination of the new make and the American oak. I do not find it myself as such in the new make. So it's not the whole orange note is not present in the new make. You find lots of fruity notes, but not that typical orange note. So that orange note comes from somewhere from the interaction between the new make and the wood. So it's something in that interaction where it comes into being. So unfortunately, my life is not that simple that I can say, well, this is exactly where it comes from. It's often a combination of factors that create these flavor profiles.
And your fermentation, your mashing, anything you do differently than the traditional Scottish way that you've learned to adapt to your local conditions?
Yeah, little things. So it's on the whole, it's the same thing everywhere. Yeah, you mill the grain, you mix it with water, extract the sugars, pump the sugary water to the fermenter and ferment it. That is the same for everybody that makes malt whiskey. It's like brewing a beer and then distilling it. But there's little things we do different from my friends in Scotland. And different doesn't necessarily mean better. It means different, because they make wonderful whiskies in Scotland. It's just that I think there's things that we can improve upon. And one of them is that we start with, when we mill the grain, we mix it with hot water. That's the same everywhere. Same temperature, 64, 65 degrees Celsius. Water, that's the same for everywhere as well. And then when we drain the worts, so the sugary water that you drain off the grain mixture, in Scotland, typically that would be pumped straight into the fermenter, into the washback. What we do differently is we take that wort and we recirculate it over the grain bed. So using the grain bed as a filter, we filter the sugar water, the worts, until it's crystal clear. And only when it's crystal clear, it gets pumped into the fermenter. It's, it might seem like a teeny weeny difference, but it makes a difference in flavor. And I'm not saying better or worse, but it's what it does is it creates this clear wort as opposed to a cloudy wort. And where the yeast loves this cloudy wort, it starts to work really hard. But as a result, it also creates a lot of side products. So it ferments really fast. And in that really fast fermentation, it creates a lot of what we call higher alcohols, fusel oils. So these are carbohydrate chains that are longer than your typical ethanol. And that creates a kind of grainy, fatty flavor to your new make. First to the beer, of course, and then to your new make. So when we make a really clear wort, we have a cleaner beer, so less higher alcohols, and also therefore less grainy, fatty flavors in our new make. And then the next thing we do is enhance that by temperature controlling the fermentation. So typically in Scotland these days, 48-hour fermentations are the norm. Yeah, so everybody is doing 2-day fermentations. So what we do is we cool the worts down, and then not letting the temperature rise like they do in Scotland. We keep the temperature at that same temperature throughout the fermentation period. So we cool the wort, the whole beer during the fermentation period. We cool the beer down, and then that's why we stretch. That's when we stretch the fermentation time for at least 7 days. So the minimum fermentation time that we use is 7 days. So it's a long, slow, cool fermentation, which of course takes more resources and it's a little bit more expensive to do. But that gives also more time for malolactic fermentation to take place, and also more time for bacterial growth to take place in your beer, which is not exactly good for your yield, but it creates all kinds of interesting fruity flavors in the beer. And of course, all those fruity flavors can be selected into the new make.
And one quick question before we get on to the next whiskey from Josh is the yeast you use the standard distiller's yeast that they use in Scotland? Have you got your own recipe, your own secret suppliers?
Yeah, that's a good thing. I forgot about that. But of course, good question. We do use the standard M strain distiller's yeast that they use in Scotland, but we mix it in a secret mixer because it's a 50-50 mixer. Don't tell anybody. And we mix this yeast with in this case, a Belgium ale yeast. Not a Belgian beer yeast. So this beer yeast produces a lot of fruity flavors. And you would think, why don't you just use the beer yeast? Because the beer yeast is really poor, and it leaves a lot of residual sugars in the beer. And residual sugars is one, a waste of resources, and second, it's something that might burn into the heating elements in your still. So we as distiller, we want zero or as close to zero residual sugar in your beer. So therefore, we add the M strain distiller's yeast, who is very efficient in mopping up after the beer yeast.
Great. Well, let's get on to the next whiskey, and then we'll get back to some of the questions. We won't forget those. Next one is the 10-year-old French oak.
Yeah, that's my brother's favorite whiskey.
Now the previous one, the American oak, was at 43%.
Yes.
This is at 40%, but they're all non-chill filtered. How do you manage that?
They're all non-chill filtered, which creates problem in this whiskey on occasion. You might find a bottle that's a little bit hazy, but that's because of the non-chill filters nature of the whiskey. But I don't want to filter it too harshly, because it takes away a little bit of that creaminess of the whiskey. If you do chill filtering, you do take out a little bit of the fatty acids and the higher alcohols, and those create that kind of creamy, velvety sensation in the mouth, or at least add to that sensation in the mouth. So therefore, I don't want to filter it too harshly. And the 40% is because to emphasize the easygoing nature of this whiskey, because I find it very easy, mellow, drinkable whiskey. It's fruity, it's mellow, it's easygoing, a bit like me. Oh no, that's not what my wife says. But it's an easygoing whiskey, and this whiskey, to emphasize that easygoing aspect of it, we bottle it at 40. But like I said, it does create some issues with haze on occasion because we don't chill filter.
40. Yeah, so the American oak, fruity, American oak is 43. The French oak is 40. Yes.
Yes. But for me, it's a very fruity, easygoing, whiskey.
Yeah, it's quite floral on the nose as well, but I say even at 40%, it has got that creamy mouthfeel to it, which is fantastic.
Yeah. It doesn't get weak because of the 40%. The 40% kind of fits this whiskey. We tried it, of course, at different ABVs. When you do non-chill filtered like we do, the standard you go to percentage is 46, because it's just kind of safe alcohol level where you have not too many problems with hazing. But this is the 40% is exactly tailored to this whiskey to make it, to emphasize the natural state of it.
So it's you say your brother's favorite whiskey.
Yes,
did he make the decision for the 40%, or was it did you have
it
to
was something we argued about, because from a production perspective, I hate hazy whiskeys, not because they don't taste well, but because they don't look well on the shelf. So I'm always a bit careful, and rather do it at 46. But he's right. This 40% suits the whiskey. It kind of emphasizes that easygoing, mellow character of the whiskey and makes it very drinkable and a suave kind of whiskey to drink, especially with the fruity character that you get with this whiskey. This got a lot less vanilla and than the American oak. Yeah, this is more fruit oriented, like you get from the French oak. Yeah, the French oak casks, of course, are difficult to work with, because they tend to have a lot of tannins. So again, this is a mixture of virgin French oak and refill. But you can imagine that with the American oak, it's sometimes almost 50-50 blend, 50% new and 50% refill. And here we have to be more careful with the virgin oak, because they can have a lot of tannins, and that would take away from that kind of mellow mouthfeel that we want to aim for with this whiskey.
And your barley, is it all grown locally? Do you try and use as much local produce as you can?
Yeah, we grow about 70% of the grain ourselves. We had a bit of a bad rye harvest last year, where we lost about 40% of our rye that we had on the fields, because we grow the grain mostly around the distillery here in the village. And we had a big thunderstorm somewhere in June, and that flattened like 14 hectares of rye. All gone just like that. Well, this is the things you have to deal with when you grow your own grain. That sometimes you have this kind of fluke of nature, where you cannot influence that whatsoever to change that. It's was all gone. One storm. Couple of hours and 14 hectares of land, and the other field was right next to it, was unharmed. It was not even 100 meters difference.
And your backup plan, where's your alternative source of grains, barley and rye?
No, and we also keep some stock, of course, because we try to grow most of the grain ourselves. You do keep some stock, and worst case, right now actually, this morning I had some rye coming in that we didn't grow ourselves. And that was just unfortunate, because normally for the past few years we were completely self-sufficient with the rye. But this year, because of the fluke accident from last year, there was simply a little bit of shortage on the rye side.
Great. Well, after the first two were the 10-year-olds, The next two, the next one we'll do is the special 16 in a fantastic tall bottle. And it's not a 16-year-old; it's the 16th special release, and this is the double sherry cask, Oloroso and PX, distilled in 2010. Are these some of the limited releases that you do from time to time, or is it just every now and again?
Yeah, my brother does sales, and we are a family distillery, so my brother does the sales, and he just doesn't let me, endlessly increase my portfolio of whiskies. He says, there's only so much shelf space in the stores, so you have to keep it a little bit limited. So what we do is we have a core range of products where we always like the American oak, the Oloroso, and on top of that, we have these releases where I can play around and which are temporary in nature. And when the release is sold out, we follow it up with something new that I found in the warehouse somewhere.
And so this one, obviously, we've got some stock of it in Australia, and the mix of sherry casks, Oloroso and PX. Now you do the one we get to is 100% Oloroso, but the mix, what's the ratio? Are you allowed to tell us that?
Yeah, it's a very secret ratio of about 40-60, 45-55 to be more precise. It's quite closely matched, and the reasoning behind it was that Oloroso gives these wonderful notes of dried fruit like raisins and other dried fruits, and some nuttiness especially in the flavor profile. You get this kind of toasted nuts from the Oloroso. And then the PX, of course, gives you deep chocolatey flavors with a little bit of a herbaceous note somewhere in there. So both very interesting cask types, I think. And of course, the PX has a little bit of sweetness from the PX cask, especially if they're first fill PX cask. It gets a little bit of sweetness from the PX wine that was in the cask. And I think together they make quite a harmonious whiskey, and it also gives it a lovely, deep, rich, kind of luscious color. Yeah, this is kind of big, luscious color.
Yeah, Henry mentioned that the color looks darker in the bottle than the little sample. Obviously, the smaller bottle is it's being thinner and the light coming through. It would. I'm certainly getting the kind of mocha chocolate on the nose. Absolutely. Are these first fill or refill casks?
In this case, they're all first fill. So you can tell from the color. Yeah? Refill is often a more elegant color. This is a bit in your face kind of color. If you look, I don't know if you can see it but it's quite extensively dark in the bottle. That is very typical for first fill casks. And also, because it was a special release, I could maybe experiment a little bit of how far you can pull this first fill, how far you can go with this first fill, because you have to keep the whiskey balanced as well. So that was the trick with this whiskey, to keep it balanced, both between the cask types, so between the nuttiness from the Oloroso and the herbaceous richness of the PX, and on the other hand, with the whiskey that was in the cask, of course. So it has to be a whole. But yeah, if you smell it, I'm not dissatisfied. It gives you the kind of richness from the new make still, or at least from the whiskey. The distillery character is still very recognizable, I think, and it does blend very well with the cask type. So yeah, so this is all an exercise in balance. This was a bit walking the tightrope between the different cask types and trying to see if we can pull it out of the hat and make a balanced whiskey out of it, even though it's all first fill, not virgin oak, but first fill sherry.
And the range of whiskies that we've got here that we're trying today are around about the 10 to 12 years old as an average. That seems to be a sweet spot for your whiskies. But in terms of the your angel share in the Netherlands compared to, say, Scotland? Is there, do you lose a lot more? Is there a maximum age you think that that you can mature to, or else it'll just be dust in the bottom of your barrels?
That also depends on the barrel. Huh? So you get differences in angel share percentages between barrels. So butts, of course, percentage-wise, I lose less in 500-liter casks than in 200-liter casks. There is a difference in angel share. On average, our angel share in Holland is about between 6 and 8%. That is our standard angel share. And on virgin oak casks, the first year can be up to 12%. So it's a big angel share. My friends in Scotland are usually somewhere between 1 and 1.4% per year. So it's a different kind of angel share.
And what are the oldest whiskies that you've got in your warehouses? That
I think the oldest whiskey that I thought were well put together, well made, was from 1996. And unfortunately, there's not a full warehouse of that either. There's only like a handful of casks left of 1996.
The obviously
which is
growing,
a shame, of course. Yeah.
Yes, of course. Family distillery. You grew up in the distillery. You're obviously passionate about what you're doing. But was there always an expectation from your parents that you'd end up in the business? You and your brother must have been the most popular boys at school with your parents owning the distillery.
Well, we were poor, of course, because my parents started the distillery with no money. They didn't come from money, so they were working class people. So people that had to work really hard to get where they were. So no, we were actually quite poor when I grew up. And you think child labor is something that happens in China, but here in Holland, after school, when other kids went to play football, we were often hoisted into the company, and we worked in the company after school. Helped putting bottles on the bottling, with the bottling or the labeling or whatever needed to be doing. Emptying the still, cleaning the stills. I was quite a small child, so my father just put me inside the still with a little thing to clean it. This is how we grew up. And because the company was small, it was difficult. Distilleries are great, but you need a little bit of body to make a little bit of money. So you need some volume to it, and running a small distillery was not an easy way to make money. So my parents said, please get yourself an education and get a real job. Yeah, do something with your lives instead of working your ass off 7 days a week and not making any money. So both me and my brother were sent to different schools and finish university. And after university, I came back into the company to help out basically for a couple of years, because I had a master's degree in information management. So there was back in the 90s, you can imagine there was a lot of people interested in offering me a job. And yeah, but if you grow up in a distillery, there's something about working in a distillery. There's something nice about it. Yeah, you're working with flavors. You're meeting nice people from around the world, and that kind of gets to you. It's difficult to leave behind. So yeah, I came into the company. The company started growing a little bit by bit, and 25 freaking years later, I'm still here, working 7 days a week and 90 hours a week. But yeah, who cares? Who needs a holiday?
One day they'll find the keys to the padlock on your chains.
Yeah. Well, I don't know. But it's a wonderful business to be in. Yeah, you do meet a lot of. The longer it's in the glass, the more depth it gets. Yeah, the double sherry cask.
Some of the comments we've got is the nuttiness, and one so it's quite descriptive that I haven't heard before, is a overfruited carrot cake.
Overfruited carrot cake, is that good or bad?
No. It's Andrew thinks it's good. with a thick frosting of walnuts. I can just picture
Yes,
that. Yes,
yeah, that
yes.
kind of walnutty thing is on the. That's from the Olorosos. Hazelnuts, walnuts. It's very from the Oloroso wine casks.
Yeah. Right, the next one, the fourth one, is the special 17, another one of the special releases, and that is the American Oak Muscatel, also a 2010 distillation.
It's
A
actually
lot
from the
lighter.
same batch, I think, if I remember correctly.
Yep.
It is from actually the same production of whiskey, and if you put them side by side, do I have that correct? If you put them side by side, you can see how much influence the cask type has on the whiskey as such, not just on the color, because you can see the color is completely different. It doesn't look anything like the you see the double sherry cask is way darker than the Muscatel sherry. So it's a completely different, but also in the nose, it gives you a completely different whiskey. You know, you would hardly say.
We're on the special
distillery.
17. Yep, the American Oak Muscatel.
So it's the same batch as the special 16. So it's the same batch of whiskey. But you can get a completely different whiskey just by aging it in a different cask type. And so you hear, this was actually a combination of, these are sherry casks. Yeah? This is sherry Muscatel sherry. And as you know, the sherry ages in Solera system. So it means that they have 4 rows of cask on top of each other. The bottom casks have the oldest sherry in them, and they take out about a third of that sherry to bottle into glasses, into bottles. And then the bottom casks are filled to the top with the sherry from the second crianza, and then the second crianza is filled up with the third crianza, and so forth and so forth. So the top casks have on average the youngest sherry, and the bottom casks have, of course, the oldest sherry on average. Which also means that, and nobody talks about this in my business, but this means that sherry casks, even if they're from the same bodega and have held the same sherry, it matters which Solera, which layer of the Solera they came from. Where the top casks often still have that kind of freshness that you would associate with younger wine, and the bottom cask have the most heavily oxidized aromas. When you blend these casks together, you have to keep that in mind, that you have to taste every stupid freaking cask before you blend it, because they are all different. And the same with this Muscatel sherry. At this time, I chose 2 butts that probably came from the top of the Solera, because they had a lot of orchard fruit, like apples and pears and green fruits kind of thing. So the kind of freshness that they had was wonderful. And I chose 2 butts that came from the bottom of the Solera. And those were heavily into like flowery aromas, like violet and kind of jasmine type aromas. They had been from the same Solera, from the same bodega that I bought them, but they produced completely different whiskeys. And when I put them together, I thought you get this wonderful harmony between one side the fruitiness and the floweriness of the butts.
Yeah, but a lot more spiciness and a bit more tannins as well. The so the special 16 and 17 from the same batch of distillate,
yes,
and
the same
matured,
new make, basically.
Yep, and matured for a similar amount of time. They're both
yeah, I think one was a little bit before the other, of course, because they're different. But yeah, I don't think there was a 6 months difference between them two. So a different type of whiskey you end up with.
Yeah, completely. Yeah,
and this is how this is nice for educational purposes to see how that whiskey changes when you put it in a different type of barrel. Huh? So you you choose a different barrel, you different cask, and you get a different type of whiskey. So, what we try to do when we put whiskies in casks, we try to find casks that we think are going to work well with that new make, because you have to have that interaction between the new make and the whiskey and the barrel, and it has to end up being a harmonious unity, instead of what you get sometimes in Scotland is that they age something for 10 years, and then they finish it in for 3 months in a port cask or in a sherry cask. That way you don't get that kind of integration that we always look for. It has to be fully integrated into the cask and into the whiskey, so that it has to have that kind of integration, that where everything is one, and it's like a marriage. After you stop arguing with your wife because you cannot win it anyway. That kind of thing you need in the whiskey as well.
Now, the first time I was exposed to the Millstone whiskies in Australia, almost was by accident, but then they were promoted at our whiskey show in Melbourne probably 4 or 5 years ago, and somebody grabbed me by the arm and said, "You have to come and try this whiskey." But what's it been like in the Netherlands, firstly, in your home country, and the rest of Europe and the world? Has it been hard to actually get people to drink Dutch whiskey? Well, people parochial, are they supporting you in the Netherlands because you are local?
I don't think in the Netherlands we are that kind of chauvinist. Here in Europe, the French are very chauvinist. They promote their own products very hard, and I think in the Netherlands it was quite the opposite to begin with. In the beginning, here in the Netherlands, we drank Scotch. That's it. Yeah, we didn't drink Japanese whiskey. We didn't drink whiskeys from other countries. Scotch whiskey was what we drank here in the Netherlands. It's just that you had to prove over time that the whiskey that we produced was on par, or maybe in some cases better than what my friends in Scotland were producing. And slowly, you started to gain that market share that you need to have a ongoing concern, to have a distillery that can keep producing. So yeah, it took time, but yeah, you have to convince people slowly that your whiskeys are worth it.
Right. Now we get into the next whiskey. We like to keep our sessions to about an hour. We've got about 15 minutes left, and a couple more whiskeys and a few more questions. But the next one is the 100 Rye.
Okay.
And this was the whiskey at the whiskey show that somebody said, "You got to try this." Rye whiskey from the Netherlands. The ryes come from America, and well, now obviously a lot of Australian distilleries are making a rye. But what was the why did Millstone make rye whiskey?
For us, of course, it wasn't as strange as it might seem, because yes, malt whiskey was the ultimate and the most important whiskey type in the Netherlands. But on the other hand, rye distillation, rye grain, has been grown here in Holland since forever. Yeah, because where we live in the south of Holland, we have really poor sandy soils. So the soil type did not support very well things like wheat or barley 200 years ago, because the soils were very poor and sandy. So it needed a grain that could survive in that kind of harsh conditions that the south of Holland and the east of Holland had to offer. So rye was one of those grains that were always grown here in the Netherlands, because it was the grain that wanted to grow. It's the grain that didn't die on the field. So that's why rye has always been part, and still now, rye is an easy grain to grow. It's a hardy grain. It doesn't need much in the sense of irrigation. It doesn't need much in the sense of nutrients. It's an easy grain to grow. So it's always been part of Dutch distillation, because one of the things 200 years ago, now we grow the grain that we want to distill or that we want to eat. And we can add nutrients and whatever the grain needs into the soil. But 200 years ago, you had to make do with what the soil offered you. And rye grew here, but let's be honest, people didn't want to eat rye. You know, rye bread was always made here in the Netherlands, but the favorite was always wheat bread made from wheat. So the wheat was eaten first, and when there was no more wheat, people ate rye. And you know how it was 200 years ago. People distilled not what they wanted to distill, but whatever the fuck was left. Oh, beep. Oh, sorry. But yeah, that's what it was. It was whatever grain was left was distilled. And because wheat was always eaten, the rye was often the grain that was left to distill. So it's always been part of the Dutch distillation heritage because it was the grain that was available for distillation. And as you know, it's a difficult grain to distill. Yeah, so the mashing is difficult because of the beta glucans in it. It's like if you mash rye for rye whiskey, and this is 100% rye whiskey, you got this slimy consistency in the mash. It's like, you know, wallpaper paste. Do you wallpaper your house in Australia? It's, now people don't do it anymore here in Holland, but you know, it's from my youth, from my childhood, I can still remember wallpapering my room, and it's got this slimy wallpaper paste, got this slimy consistency, the glue that they use for wallpaper. Now that's what a tank of rye mash is like as well. It's a slimy, thick consistency, very gloopy, very difficult to mash. You cannot make a very high gravity mash because you cannot mix it in anymore. And then fermentation is also tricky because you can imagine if you have a malt whiskey, you have a nice foam head on your fermenter, but the foam is like you have on your beer, and not the stupid English beer, but real beer where you have a nice foam head on the beer. And it's fluffy foam, so it's not a problem. But you can imagine with rye being gloopy, slimy, wallpaper paste consistency, that if that ferments really fast, half your fermentation sometimes ends up on the floor instead of in the tank. So you have to keep the temperature right down and make sure that, especially on the first 2-3 days, the fermentation takes off very slowly so that the bubbles that form have time to break before they foam out of the tank. So yeah, you know, through your mistakes you learn, we say in Holland here, and this is what we had to do. You know, many a time I had to clean the floors on Monday morning when the rye had been very enthusiastically fermenting. So it's a difficult grain to work with, but then if you taste it, it's got that famous kind of richness that you have from rye grain. You know, it's we distill it not in a column, but in our pot stills where we also distill the malt whiskies in. I can remember when I went to Richard Forsyth's, who is one of the big producers of pot stills in Scotland, and said, Richard, I want to make a new pot still, and you have to build it for me. And yes, by the way, I also want to distill rye in it. And he looked at me like I was freaking crazy. He says, rye in a pot still? What are you doing? You need a column for that because you cannot do it in a pot still. But I want to do it in a pot still because I like that creaminess you get from pot still distillations. There's nothing wrong with column stills, but that your pot still gives you that, like a, how do I describe that? That kind of velvety, stupid mouthfeel that you get from a pot still that is not comparable with a column still whatsoever. And that's what we did. So we create this kind of stupid distillate which is rich and creamy, and put it in. This is all virgin oak. And then you see again that this is a longer fermentation still. This is like 9-10 day fermentations. So this is really stupidly long fermentations. Not in this case, not because we want it to be, but because it's such a difficult product to ferment. So we stretch out the fermentation even longer to make sure that we get this kind of result. And you can smell the almost sweet oranges on the nose, I think even more here than on the American oak malt whiskey. Because this is pure virgin oak.
And on the label, those of you who have had the 100 rye, it reinforces that no, the 100 just isn't all about 100% rye. It's 100 proof, 100 months old, 100% rye grain, 100% small batch, 100% milled by Dutch windmills, 100% small pot still distillation, 100% new American oak, and 100% handmade. Now, somebody asked the question, because we also get the 92 rye here in Australia. Other than the ABV, what are the differences between the 92 and the 100 rye?
Not much. I think the 92 is different because it's younger. Oh, it's younger. Yeah. So it's not just the ABV, it's also the age. It's a younger whiskey. It's about 4 or 5 years old on average. So it's on average 3, 4, 5 years younger than the 100. And that gives you a different result. Personally, I even like the 92 better because it's got, what do you call that? More radiant brightness to it. This is very well matured. Yeah, so this is rich and round, and as as a sipping whiskey, this is wonderful. But the 92 has got that vibrancy that maybe this lacks a little bit. This has got that rich roundness, which is all nice and good, but that 90 still is more youthful. It's more, energetic. And I think the whiskey is 100% the same, except for the little bit of ABV, but between 46 and 50 is not a huge step. But it's the age that it makes the biggest difference.
Yeah, Josh says that he prefers the nose on the 92, but the palate on the 100. Maybe that's the ABV.
Yeah, that is the thing. Yeah, that is not just the ABV, but also the age. That the age emphasizes that creaminess as well, and the age emphasizes that richness and the creaminess in the mouthfeel. There's no substitute for age in whiskey. Yeah? I wish there was, but there's none. The age is paramount for creating that kind of rich mellowness in the creaminess in the mouth, and there's no way you can copy that in a shorter period of time. That said, I think the 92 has got its merits other than the 100. So it's a different whiskey. I think it comes across as a different kind of character.
Yeah. Have you had a chance to try any of the Australian ryes? Otherwise, we'll have to get.
No, I would be very interested because rye whiskey is a bit of my baby. Because let's be honest, here in Holland, rye whiskey is not our national favorite. People drink malt whiskey here, and rye whiskey is a bit. So, but I keep making it until people learn how to freaking drink it. And if they don't want to drink it, I'll shove it down their throats because I want to keep making it. Yeah. But yeah, I'm very interested in rye whiskey. I love some of the Canadian ryes that I had were wonderful. And I'm sure the Australia ryes are interesting because you do some wonderful malt whiskies there in Australia. So I'm actually very curious to see how the ryes. But you haven't sent me any, David. What is that?
Well, that's my homework. Some Archie Rose, some Belgrove. I'll put a pack
I'll be
together.
very interested in that actually.
It's done, and you guys are my witnesses. Patrick's gonna get some.
How do they age them? How do they age the rye whiskeys? Are they aged in American oak cask or?
Yep. Yeah, and there's a lot of different styles and different types of ryes. There's the gospel as well. Yes, sorry, Jason. There's quite it's a kind of a bit of a cult following with a lot of the distilleries where rye is taken.
We as distillers, as a parent, you cannot ask a parent which is their favorite child. Yeah, but let's be honest, often the most difficult child is the one you cherish the most, and rye is the most difficult child that we make.
Yeah, so gospel, Archie Rose, and Belgrove, and I'll get a few others. Now the last whiskey, getting back to the single malts, certainly one that I've got a soft spot for, and
yeah, me too. This is my go-to home dram, I think.
When it comes to Oloroso sherry 12-year-old whiskies, this is my favorite of all time. I can't get past this one. 46%, 12-year-old, 100% Oloroso.
Yeah, it's a malt whiskey, so it's made in the same way as the 10 years old that we had before, or the other the specials that we had before. But yeah, the difference is just one thing. This is 100% matured for its entire lifetime in Oloroso sherry casks, and not the seasoned type that some distilleries use. This is all old Solera casks. So we're talking about casks that have held sherry between 40 and 100 years old. So old, decrepit, crappy old Solera casks, but difficult to work with because they're, they leak often and they're quite tender and difficult to work with. But they create this kind of special nose that is irreplaceable. You can make wonderful whiskey with seasoned casks. And look at Macallan, look at some of my other friends in Scotland. They make wonderful whiskeys with seasoned casks, but there's no substitute for these kind of old, disgusting Solera cask, because they're old and they're decrepit and they're cracked and difficult to work with. But yeah, when you combine them, you got this kind of richness, and especially when it gets this age to this age. And even I have some whiskeys bottled that were 23 years old from the same type of cask. Yeah, you get that wonderful old leathery note as well in the background. The older it gets this kind of rancio and leather, and yeah, it is a wonderful cask type to use.
Yeah, this one ambushes you. Your nose, yeah, it's nice. You take a sip, and then all of a sudden, that finish just keeps going. And guys, if you can just take a sip and just leave it there. Just leave it in your mouth, swallow it, and minutes later, you've got more of those flavors coming through, the chocolate, the mocha, the cocoa, and that
special nuttiness, the special nuttiness you get from these old casks, that kind of nutty character from the Oloroso wine.
I had some of this last night as well, and I didn't wash my glass. I left it empty on the counter.
Yeah.
This morning I came back and I nosed it again, and it was absolutely magnificent.
It gets even more beautiful when the glass is empty. Yeah. Yeah, this is one of my favorite whiskeys that we produce. I know every parent should not tell which one of their child is their favorite, but yeah, this is one of my favorite children. Yeah.
And if anything happened, heaven forbid, that you could no longer drink Millstone whiskey, what would be your fallback? What's your other whiskeys that you enjoy?
I don't think that will be the end of the world, because there's so many great whiskeys out there. Like you said, you produce some wonderful whiskeys in Australia, though they don't seem to come to Europe very much. We don't get a lot of them here, but I've got friends all over the world that produce wonderful whiskey. I love Japanese whiskeys. Japanese whiskeys, they make some wonderful whiskey as well. I love what Ian did at Kavalan. They did some wonderful things at Kavalan as well. And of course, yeah, I'm a big sucker for old Macallans. Yeah, the Macallans from the 50s and 60s are awesome to taste and nose, and there's no substitute for that kind of old-fashioned Scottish quality. There's just wonderful as well. So yeah, there's lots of whiskey to choose from. It's not like we are the only game in town. There's so many wonderful distilleries around the world. I've got a friend in the Cotswolds Dan that's doing wonderful things with Cotswolds whiskey. There's so many to choose from. Yeah, I don't think that it will be the end of the world if we cease to exist. But yeah, this is. I think we try to carve our niche into the world, and we try to create a different flavor profile, maybe a little bit more old-fashioned flavor profile than the current Scotch producers are doing. I think more emphasis on craftsmanship, on heritage, on old casks and things that are more difficult to do when you're a really big distillery in Scotland.
Great. And yeah, a few people have commented about this 12-year-old Oloroso, is that it's not so sweet. Everybody makes the assumption that sherry is always going to be sweet, but
also the nose is sweet. If you smell Oloroso, it smells sweet. it smells fruity and sweet, and it, of course, in the mouth it's a dry sherry, and not like PX, because PX is a sweet sherry, but Oloroso is of course a dry sherry, and it's got no residual sugar whatsoever in the whiskey or in the cask or in the wine.
We've got time for a couple more questions, so if you do fire those through on the chat. But Henry said that Netherlands is going to be on his travel list when we can travel again. But do you have a visitor? Do you have a visitor center at your distillery?
No, but if they send me an email, I'll make sure that I'll make some room in my schedule to show them around the distillery.
Excellent, and the windmills, of course.
The windmills are quite close. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Patrick, thanks for your time. I really appreciate you. I know it's always busy at a distillery and lots to do and lots of challenges. And hopefully we can travel. We can see you in Australia. We can be in the Netherlands, but certainly we'll continue enjoying your great whiskies.
Oh,
thanks
super.
very much.
Thank you for organizing this, David. Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everybody. And just remember to go onto the Whisky List app. If you haven't downloaded it yet, you can rate these whiskies. And through the app, when you purchase, you get $10 off as well. So we still have stock and continue enjoying the Millstones.
Thank
Goodbye,
you, David.
everybody. So just one question. Yep. Quick question, Henry.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
That's the best kind of bottle, right? The empty one.
Yes.
Good. Okay, that was my first experience with Millstone, and I've kept the bottle because I loved it so much. It was a distillation date of 25/10/01, bottled in 2015. Oloroso.
So it was generously 12 years old, yeah?
Very generous. And can I say that was an absolute surprise for me. Never tried Millstone before. And when I tasted it, it was just phenomenal. And I was hoping that I would try something Oloroso again. And as you supplied it with your last whiskey, I thought, fantastic. So well done, honestly.
Did you get any of the chance to try any of the older Olorosos?
No, that was the
only we do a young version of this. So this is the 12 years old, which usually is somewhere between 12 and 15 years old. These days we also do a 4-year-old, which is exactly the same whiskey, but at 4 years old, and that is the same as with the rye whiskey. It's more fruity, more frisky, more, but it's got this wonderful Oloroso notes as well. But it's a different character because it's younger. And then sometimes we have some really old casks of this, like 23 or 24 years old. And they have this, you can see the progression. If you would had the opportunity to taste them all, you see that you get from the youthfulness of the 4 or 5-year-old Oloroso sherry cask to that 12-year-old that you have in your hand, to that 23-year-old that we also bottle. And you get that, you see how the whiskey changes over time. And it's not necessarily that one is better than the other, but it's that kind of like progression in our lives. Yeah, we start out, we are maybe a little bit more rambunctious and crash a car or two, or fall from the couch, or forget to go to bed before school or whatever. And then later in life, you get more responsible, and the whiskeys are the same. From the young one that is more frivolous and more energetic, to the 12-year-olds, which is like middle-aged, kind of wonderful, harmonious, married with children, to the older ones, they would have that wonderful depth of flavor. And yeah, I think that is also, if you would ever have the opportunity to try them in session, otherwise you have to come over and we'll do it here. I'm happy to do that.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you. And the $10 discount should be loaded into the app already. So you don't have to do anything. Just purchase through the app, and it will be there. So thanks, everybody, and hope to see you at our sessions again. Thanks, Patrick. Thanks. We'll see you soon, and I will send you those ryes.
Thank you, David.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.